Well, in less than 3 weeks now, I am going to be taking my firstborn son to college. Let us pray. As we've been preparing for this next stage of his life and ours, it's caused me to reflect back on my own time in college. And among other things, I've been trying so hard to remember all the things that people said to me when I was starting college that ended up being helpful so that I could pass them on to my son. And one of the things that I had kind of forgotten about was this. When I was about to start college, someone said to me, "Scott, when you go to college, you're going to find that you stop studying subjects and you start studying people." And what he meant by that was, when we're young, you study subjects, right? You study math and science and English and all the others. And of course, when you go to college, you're still doing that. You're taking courses and all the various subjects that are required. But you start as an adult paying a lot more attention to the people who are teaching than you ever have before. And you start modeling your life after the ones that you find most attractive. You find you don't just want to know what they know, you want to be like them. And for me, that turned out to be so true. To this day, I can think of so many of my college professors, and I can pick out very specific qualities about each one of them that I have tried to model in my own life. For example, still want to have the humility and wisdom of Dr. Gieshin, my beloved music professor. I want to have the humor and biblical wisdom of Dr. Hine, my theology professor. I want to have the passion and inspiration of Dr. Fisher, our band director, and there are many others. I find it funny that 25 years later, I don't remember hardly a single thing that they actually taught me specifically. But I still remember them, and I want to be like them. I say all this by way of introduction because I find the same thing happening with the Apostle Paul, and especially in our scripture readings for today. I invite you to turn to page 3 of your worship folder. You can follow along with me there. Now, of course, there's so much about Paul that is commendable and that we could learn from. But when I look at Paul, and especially today, I don't think to myself that I want his spiritual insight or his character or his passion, though I'm sure I could learn from him in any of those areas also. But what stands out to me most in our readings for today is that I want to learn how to suffer like Paul. This little story that we're looking at in Acts 16 is really an amazing story. Paul is out and about preaching the gospel. He's telling others about Jesus, and he's had a lot of success. God has been using him, and he's had all kinds of amazing things happen. But then in this reading, things go wrong, like horribly wrong. If you look specifically at this story, you realize this is not just a bad day. This was a terrifically violent episode in Paul's life. Notice the specific words that are used here. Take a look on the screen here. They didn't just talk to Paul and Silas. No, it says they seized them. They didn't just bring them to the authorities. No, it says they dragged them there. The crowd doesn't just speak out against them and what they've done. No, the writer of Acts describes this as an attack, not just a conversation. And from there on, it only gets worse. It says the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten. Not even just beaten, stripped and beaten. So they weren't just arrested, they were utterly humiliated and tortured. And then notice they weren't just flogged, it says they were severely flogged. And they weren't just taken to prison, it says they were thrown in prison. This is not just a bad day. As I said, this is a horrifically violent episode in Paul's life. So here's my question. How do you think you would respond if something like that happened to you? I've been thinking about this, and I can think of at least 3 responses that I'm certain I would have if something like this happened to me. First, I think I would be terribly angry. And not just angry at the people who did these awful things. I think I would be angry at God. I would be thinking, hey, God, why are you letting all of this happen to me? I mean, I'm out there trying to do your work. And second, I think I would start praying to God to get me the heck out of there, right? I would pray over and over and over and ask God to deliver me from this terrible suffering. And then, number 3, when God brings the earthquake and the prison doors fly wide open, I know this for sure, I would run. Right? I would get out of there as fast as I could, and I would never look back. Does that sound about right? Is that what you would do? Do you notice Paul does none of those things? Paul doesn't appear to get angry at all. In fact, it says Paul is up late at night singing worship songs. And the text never says that he prayed for his release. Now, maybe he did, and it's just not recorded here specifically, but the fact that it isn't tells you that that wasn't really his primary concern. And the way you can tell this for sure is by what happens when the earthquake comes. The doors of the prison fly wide open, and Paul doesn't run. He stays right where he is. He goes right back to work sharing about Jesus. And we see at the end, God blesses it in an amazing way. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at this reading and I want to know, how in the world do you become a person like that? How do you become the kind of person who can reflect back years later on horrific circumstances like that and say, as Paul did in our other reading, we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. How do you do that? We all know this is not automatic, not even for Christians. One of my favorite Christian authors wrote a best-selling book about suffering, and here's what he says he observed along the way. He says, I came to realize that at the heart of why people disbelieve and believe in God, of why people decline and grow in character, of how God becomes less real and more real to us, is suffering. In other words, sometimes people lose their faith because of suffering, but other times people end up with faith that is stronger than ever. Sometimes suffering causes people to grow in compassion and kindness, but other times it causes people to become bitter and envious and joyless. And we all know this. We've seen this happen. And so the question we have to reflect on this morning is this: what is different about the way Paul deals with suffering? And what can we learn from him? I want to suggest to you 3 things this morning, and here they are. First, that suffering is to be expected. Second, that suffering has purpose. And third, that suffering is only temporary. As Paul reflects on his suffering, these 3 things stand out to me so much. Suffering is to be expected. Suffering has purpose. Suffering is only temporary. So let's talk about them. First, suffering is to be expected. Notice what Paul says here. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus. Always. Later he says, outwardly we are wasting away. It's not we might, right? We are. There's nothing you can do about it. This is the way it is. It's the way it always is, according to him. And this is so important because expectations in large measure determine our attitudes in all kinds of areas. Right? People get married and expect marriage to be nothing but joy and passion all the time, and they end up disappointed by reality. Or people have children and think that parenting is just going to be easy and fun and playing with kids all the time, and end up being very frustrated. And see, if you enter into the Christian life thinking that God is going to protect you from any serious problems in life, you are just begging to be disappointed. God never promised that. Jesus didn't even get that. Right? He lived a perfect life and he got crucified. So what makes us think we deserve better? The problem, I think, is that modern American affluence has radically changed our expectations about suffering. Think about this. Take a look at this quote. In medieval Europe, approximately 1 of every 5 infants died before their first birthday. And only half of all children survived to the age of 10. The average family buried half of their children while they were still little. And yet we have innumerable diaries, journals, historical documents that reveal how they took that hardship and grief in far better stride than we do. Now, how can that be? Well, one of the reasons was because they expected it. They weren't surprised or shocked by suffering. They understood that this is just the way it is in a broken, sinful world. And so did Paul. But now, secondly, we said Paul also understood that suffering has purpose. Notice carefully the words he uses here. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. And later, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Both of those verses state that suffering has purpose. It's not meaningless. God doesn't just work in spite of our suffering, but even through our suffering. And you see it today. In the Acts reading, you see how God uses Paul's suffering to bring this jailer and his whole family to faith in Jesus. That would never have happened without Paul's suffering. And yet it's not even just that suffering has a purpose like that for those around us. He says it has a purpose in us. Notice the words, the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. It's achieving for us an eternal glory. C.S. Lewis wrote about this in his famous book, The Four Loves. Here's what he said. Take a look at his words. He says, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, in other words, if you want to avoid any suffering in your life, you must give your heart to no one, not even an animal. Don't even have a pet. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, your heart will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. What's he saying? He's saying if you just go and avoid people altogether, which of course some people do, he says you can avoid a lot of suffering. Right? You don't want to see your spouse suffer or die? Don't have a spouse. You don't want to have children break your heart? Don't have children. Just box yourself off. But then you're going to become a shallow and selfish person. Yes, suffering is difficult, and it's through suffering, however, that God makes us compassionate and selfless and kind and loving and considerate and all the other things that He has in mind for us. Suffering's difficult, but it's not meaningless. It has purpose. I heard the story of a guy named Reynolds Price. He was a professor of English at Duke University several years ago. He was diagnosed many years earlier with spinal cancer. And he survived that, but it left him a quadriplegic for the rest of his life. And later on, after he had recovered and gone back to work, there was a young medical student at Duke who became gravely ill and had to drop out of school. And this student wrote to Reynolds because he knew that Reynolds Price was a Christian, and so he asked him in this letter, how in the world can you still be a Christian with all of the terrible things that you've had to suffer? And Reynolds Price wrote him a letter back, and this is one of the things he said to him. He said, I can't know what the ultimate outcome of your ordeal will be. I can lean on the hope that you'll go to some form of conscious and immortal life in a less mysterious place, a life in which you'll comprehend and accomplish what may be dark and closed to you now. He's trying to comfort him with the hope of heaven and doing it in a very professorial way, isn't he? But then he also said this, but if you survive this ordeal, you're almost certain to be a far more valuable medical doctor and person than you'd otherwise have been. Down the road, you'll face your own severely ill patients with a candor and sympathy that cannot be faked. What's he saying? He's saying the same thing Paul is saying, that suffering has a purpose, that God works through suffering and does great things, not only for those around us, but in us also when we suffer. And Paul understood that, and that's one of the reasons he handled suffering differently than the rest of us often do. Now, one last thing, we said Paul also understood that suffering is only temporary. And I love the words he uses here in 2 Corinthians 4 to describe his troubles. Light and momentary. I doubt those would be the words you would have used to describe what happened in Acts 16. Light and momentary. They don't seem that way. But there's a reason that he puts these two words together. He wants us to think about suffering the same way, because when we understand that our sufferings are momentary, that they have an end point, then they start to feel a whole lot lighter. Think for a moment about your own life. I mean, think about whatever is stressing you out right now, whether it's at work or at home or whatever it is. If I could guarantee to you that that struggle will end in 3 months, how much easier would it be to deal with? If I could guarantee you that, yes, this is going to be very difficult for the next 3 months, but then it will be over and over forever, wouldn't that completely change your perspective in many cases? One of the most difficult things about suffering is that we often don't know when it's going to end. And Paul is trying to help us remember that all our suffering has an end date. Some may last 3 months, some may last 3 years, some may last the rest of your life, but none of those things are going to last forever. None of them. And when you start to understand that and take that to heart, it changes the way you look at suffering. And understand the reason that Paul could do all this wasn't because he was smarter than us or stronger than us or more faithful than any of us. It was simply because he had met the risen Jesus. And Paul had been an eyewitness to the fact that God had taken the worst moment of suffering imaginable, the death of the Son of God on a cross. And he had turned it into the greatest good the world had ever seen, the salvation of the whole human race. Suffering did not hinder God's plan and purpose at all. In fact, it was the pathway to its fulfillment. And as it was for Jesus, so it is for us. Let's bow our heads and pray.